Oh, can someone hear me? We're having issues with the audio, so we've been trying. I don't really know if anyone can hear me. Okay, so you can see that some people are saying they can hear me. So I'm so sorry for the delay. We're about 12 minutes in, and we're going to begin immediately. Thank you all for joining us. Really happy to have you here. So today we're going to be talking about youth activism for disaster response. And we have some quite talented speakers with us today. So the Business Unusual webinars are aimed at addressing critical issues in Africa that the COVID pandemic could possibly aggravate or implicate, which may lead to conflict, civil unrest, or any kind of humanitarian crisis. And so what we try to do with the Business Unusual webinar is to lay ground for interactive discourse where experts or people who are knowledgeable in certain issues can discuss, have an elaborate discussion on how to respond or tackle these challenges that we have. So this webinar is going to focus on the role of youth in disaster response and how they can contribute to effective governance in critical time like this. We would also assess how young people in Africa are able to demonstrate continued leadership in their commitments as the world grapples this pandemic that everyone is worried about. So our discussion would explore the effect of the lockdowns and the restrictions of movement, how this affects young population and how young people are generating ideas from energy, ideas from this and empathy and how they're contributing to their communities. So the first speaker we have today is Abdullahi Megaskia. He's a social activist. He's also a filmmaker. So I will be his co-speaker because we're working on a project together. It's called The Untold. So what we try to do with The Untold is create a platform where vulnerable voices can be heard and where possibly from the contents that we generate from local community, we can be able to put it out there so that it contrasts with people and how people see these things, and then it could possibly influence government policies or invoke a certain change. So I just want to be sure that everyone is hearing me before we proceed. So can someone please raise his hand or do something or say something so that I can be sure that you can hear me? So yeah, I see that. So great. So what we do is we believe that this is a crucial time for humanity, especially in Nigeria, where there are lots of poor people and there are lots of socio-economic issues going around. And, there is also this gaping hole in data. We have this gaping hole in historic data, and we also have a very huge gap in what is being put out in the news out there. Most of this news are being segregated and it doesn't really reflect what people are going through. And again, throughout the past weeks, we've been getting lots of reports about the projection of how this pandemic is going to affect Africa and Africans. So what we try to do with this documentary is to give our own people their voice. It's for us to be able to, amplify their voice, influence their voice, but through our own, scope. So we don't want other people to define us or to define this moment for us. We want to be able to express ourselves and to respond to whatever crisis or whatever pandemic we're going through within our own means, and we want it to be defined the way that we see it. And for us, we thought it was very important for us to capture this moment in a form of a series. So for every week, we put out a few short clips focusing on a particular issue that we know is affecting low-income earners, especially in local communities. How is it affecting people? How are they responding to it? And how is government, providing solution for this? So the overall aim is for people to know what's happening, for people to know that even if it's bad elsewhere, other people are responding. And we also hope that government official or any public office holder can see that people are actually struggling, because this is not a merry situation. But we want it to be that people are the ones to put out their stories themselves. So I've been trying to put Abdullahi on, but I'm just going to see if he can be able to talk, because we've already taken up much of the time. So let's hear from him. So we're trying to connect with Abdullah. He's very new to this and he has self-muted himself. So we're trying to see if he can unmute himself. But we would still continue. I think we can catch up to him in the end. So that's pretty much what we're trying to do. So we're trying to use data and visualization to amplify people's voices, because we understand the gaping hole in the data that is being put out there, especially in African narrative or in the Nigerian narrative. So we just want to be able to give people that platform where they can express themselves, and where the outside community or even among community, we can be able to see how this pandemic is affecting people, so that we can come together and provide solution for peace, development, and possibly accountability. So the next person we have on is Farai Mobaiwa. So Farai is going to speak about youth and youth health during pandemic, and she's going to make a presentation of that. I'm just guessing that Farai is not online. Sorry guys for the delay. We're trying to see if Valine can take over before we get a hold of Farai.
Can you hear me?
Oh yes. So that's me, Gaskia. We can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I apologize for the delay, and then I think due to a small technical issue from my own end here. So far, I've been listening to your discussion, and part of the things we have been working on throughout this lockdown and pandemic period. Basically, I know part of the things I need to discuss here is the importance of the role the media is playing in terms of giving voices to the youths in terms of this crisis as it affects every one of us. For me, generally, I think we have a very, very important role that the media need to play, but we have to look at the media from two perspectives. First, we have the private media who works independently on their own, and then we have the ones that are coordinated by the government. At this period of time, I think it's important that we need to understand that looking at my own environment here, the media is not really doing enough, and it has a very, very important role to play. For instance, we in the private sector, even if we have plans and strategy and how to go about creating content, we also need some form of authority, access to the right information, and ability to be able to move, to be able to create some form of content that we need to generate before disseminating it out there. But on the side of the government, for me, I think the government is not doing well. So far in Nigeria, I think media flow and information has been very, very bad. And there is need for us to have a coordinated system, a strategic plan to communicate and give people room to understand what is actually going on. For instance, we're in Nigeria, a lot of people don't even know actually what is happening in Kano, for instance, Kano State. So we're getting different kind of information, different kind of news, unverified source of information that are coming. Almost everybody on their platform are posting information that we cannot really verify. But it is important that we have that kind of problem addressed. And this is where the government need to play a vital role. The government needs to have a platform. They need to have a strategic way of communicating to people and also get to hear what is going on with the people on their own side. And part of the thing we've been able to do with the social media platform, like Nasri earlier said, we are trying to give voices to the people, especially people that do not have access to the means of airing their voice or expressing their opinion. So part of the things we do will go to those targeted areas that we can access, get information from them, and then put it out there. Currently, we've released the first episode of the series of the Untold Stories that we started, and we're currently working on the subsequent episode that we're planning to release out there too. So far, I think that is the work, the progress of our work so far. Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. So that was really that was very apt. I think you rounded it up much more than I did, and in such a short period of time. So taking over now is Farai. Farai Mubayua is the co-founder of Africa Matters. She is also a South African and a colleague of mine. She's going to talk about health and youth and the nexus between youth health and youth activism, and how assistance and response for youth in this crisis is programmed, or how that assistance can be accessible by young people. Farai, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, super, super. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much for the invite and the opportunity to speak on the nexus between health and youth. I think we are living in such an interesting time where we are realizing the intersections of the two. Just before I go into some information about the nexus between youth and health, I just wanted to just share a bit. So as mentioned, I am the co-founder of an organization called Africa Matters. We focus on capacitating young Africans to be the change they want to see in their own communities. Secondly, I am also a project manager at Youth Health Africa. Youth Health Africa focuses on upskilling unemployed youth so that youth can play their role in healthcare. So we upskill youth and give them employment as entry-level workers within healthcare. So there's definitely an intersection in work I do wearing both hats, because on the one hand, Youth Health Africa focuses on both youth and health, and Africa Matters focuses on primarily youth. So I'm hoping that what I'll share today will resonate with you. If you've got any questions, please do ask them accordingly. All right, so on to the next slide. So I think it's clear that life after COVID will never be the same. we see that society has changed forever. And society has changed a number of ways. On a global scale, we now view healthcare as important. And I think we've never acknowledged the importance of healthcare and healthcare workers, but we now recognize that they're super important. Number two, we now realize that jobs that were initially deemed as low skilled are so critical to keep our economy going. And Jeremy Corbyn of the Labour Party in the UK made such a great speech the other day saying, in these times, we know who we're less able to do without in a crisis. And I think number three, society has changed because we've realized that the West is not invincible. Europe and North America, this idea of them being invincible, this idea of them being immune to any viruses or disease, it's been shattered completely. So those are the issues that we've now realized on a global scale. On the continental scale, we realize that, as Africans, there's an urgent need for us to strengthen healthcare systems for all. The interesting thing about the COVID virus is that, for the first time, African presidents have to use their own health systems. They cannot escape to other Western countries to access healthcare. And in using your own healthcare system, you then realize where the shortcomings are. And therefore, you are forced to strengthen it. Because if it's not even strengthened for yourself, how will you be able to access it? And then how are your people even using it? The second thing is we realize that we need to have even more healthcare workers in Africa, particularly if we've got an emerging youth population, and I'll go into that in a little bit. And the third is that because of COVID and its effect on different countries, and I don't think Africa has seen it's the greatest effect of this virus yet, we're still yet to see it, as predictions show from the WHO, there's now a fear of what is to come in the future. So what will life after COVID-19 be? And what will the role of youth be then in rebuilding the society we want? So we've looked now at the changes on the global scale, the continental scale, but now at the personal scale, we find that personally, there's been a change of mentality. There's a lot of us who are now saying, what can I do to play my part in society? Perhaps the career I had before was just not at all contributing, but what can I do to ensure that I'm playing my part in society? And then we also see that lockdowns across the world result in a lot of people doing more personal reflection. So a lot of people are asking, what is my role? How can I contribute? Yes, I'm just sitting at home, which is sitting at home is a good thing because I'm playing my role in flattening the curve. But after that, what can I do to then contribute? What will my life post-lockdown look like? So like I mentioned, COVID-19, life will never be the same. But I think it presents a very good opportunity for us to realize the importance of healthcare and youth and participation. And I'll go into that in a bit. So if we now look at, if we want to understand the nexus between youth and health, we need to understand the nexus between human development and healthcare, which takes me on to the next slide, right? Now, very often we hear of economic development, and that is very much emphasized, especially if we look at, at the IMF reform packages of the 1990s and 80s. Those all focused on this big need to push economic development, which was fueled by this idea of industrialization and really quick economic growth. But you cannot achieve human development. You cannot achieve economic growth without human development. And there's a really famous Indian philosopher and economist, Amartya Sen, who wrote the book Development as a Freedom. And essentially he says human development as an approach is concerned with the basic development idea. And the basic development idea is that we must advance the richness of human life. So like I mentioned, we cannot achieve economic growth without human development. Now, when we're looking at what the dimensions are of human development, this is where that nexus is between humans and health. We find that, we want to enhance human abilities. And what is the basic of enhancing human abilities? That is having a long and healthy life, knowledge, and a decent standard of living. And that is exactly where health comes in. Having a long and healthy life means that you must have access to decent quality healthcare. You must have access to, an abundance of healthcare workers who are able to step in should interventions be necessary. So I think this is what is super important here. It's recognizing that for all human beings, access to healthcare is essential. It's a part of our basic human rights. It's a part of the basics of understanding what human development is. So now that we get why we need the intersection and the nexus between human development and healthcare, let's go into youth and healthcare in Africa, right? So we get after this context that youth are included in human development. We understand now that there's a direct link between youth and healthcare because there's a direct link between humans and healthcare, and youth are, of course, humans. But we find that in Africa, this link is way more dire. It's way more direct. And why do I say this? I say this because Africa's emerging youth boom brings with it many opportunities, but also many burdens. We are a young continent, which is superb, but we've got weak social infrastructure. We've got masses of uneducated and unskilled youth. And this means that we then have more reliance on government assistance or grants to assist us because of the fact that we don't have the skills or the employment necessary. And then as youth, we become an economic burden. So we're a young continent that is an economic burden. And to defeat this burden, what do we need? So UNICEF outlined 3 things in their Generation 2030 Africa report in 2017 already. They said we need education and skills development, 100%. We need strong social infrastructure, which includes healthcare. I mean, we need strong and great access to quality healthcare. And thirdly, we need to be able to protect women and children. These are the 3 things that we need to ensure that our youth boom is not an economic burden, but an economic opportunity. And interestingly enough, that was written in 2017. So we then take a look at all of this in a post-COVID world. What does the government need to focus on? And my view is that the post-COVID world will show us that, yes, there's this nexus between youth and healthcare, which is more important in the African context because of our young economies and our youthful populations. And post-COVID, our governments need to focus on A, how do we strengthen the quality and the access to healthcare? And B, how do we solve youth unemployment? At the rate at which lockdowns are affecting economies, with such a big youthful population like Africa, your people who are being displaced economically because of various lockdowns around our continent are young people. So what we will see in the next few months is a rise in youth unemployment and a rise in healthcare challenges. As such, we need to understand that the link between youth and healthcare is so strong. And not only government has to play their part, but as young people, we also have a responsibility to play our role as well. And so let's then take a look at, so how are young people responding to COVID-19, right? What are we as young people doing in response to this virus? And this then brings us onto this next slide, right? We've got 2 sets of responses. You've got your responsible youth and then your irresponsible youth. I'd like to think that all of us who are on this call or this webinar at the moment are then responsible youth. The very fact that you want to watch a webinar on a Wednesday afternoon, I think definitely shows that you're responsible. But we find that your irresponsible youth are those that had Corona parties. And these parties were fueled by this idea that I'm young, I am invincible, I won't get ill, this virus does not kill me. And then boom, we had young people affected by the virus and dying from it. And that's when that invincibility stopped. But you've then also had, and I think mostly we've had responsible responses to COVID-19. You've had young healthcare workers in the front line, and you can see these are some of the youth I work with in this picture. They're in the front line of this virus. They're at the clinic every single day. We then have also seen a lot of youth campaigns where young people are saying, all right, I want to raise funds because I want to help the vulnerable within my community. The vulnerable can include the elderly, it can include those who are HIV positive and therefore more prone to the virus because of a weakened immune system, or it's those who have previous respiratory diseases. So young people helping the vulnerable. You then also have young people who are staying home to flatten the curve. And that's important as well, because then they're playing their part in ensuring that the virus cannot spread anymore. You also have a lot of youth organizations redirecting their efforts in light of COVID-19. So for example, Africa Matters went from having a lot of on-the-ground workshops about leadership to online workshops about leadership. And then lastly, you've got youth who are educating their communities about COVID-19. So youth who have access to information and are then sharing that information. So the last thing I want to touch on is, how can young people do more? And I think it's great that young people are responding well overall, But there's so much more that we can do, especially once you realize that there's an intersection between young people, or rather youth, and healthcare. So the last slide will look at, how can young people do more? And the first thing I want to emphasize is that we are not the leaders of tomorrow. We are not the leaders of tomorrow. We are the leaders of today. And as the leaders of today, it means that we need to act today. I also want to dispel this idea that, as the leaders of tomorrow, we shape the Africa we want tomorrow. No. We're the leaders of today. So we have to shape the Africa that we want to experience tomorrow, today. So I've listed a few things that I think as young people we can do to ensure that we are doing more in light of COVID-19, that we are doing more within our own communities and within our governments as well. The first thing is that as young people, youth participation is so valuable. And youth participation means being involved in the processes and the decisions that affect society, that affect our lives. So I've seen very often when there's a policy being passed around to the public for commentary, young people seldom engage. But it's important that we do engage. So we need increased youth participation. Secondly, we need to make youth advocacy a reality. As young people, we need to make our voices heard. If you feel strongly about an issue, then speak up about it. We need a lot more youth advocates. I would like to see in Africa that does not have presidents that are so misaligned from the needs of its people, because the presidents are 90 and its people have an average age of 20. We need to make our voices heard, and youth participation and advocacy is how we do that. Number 3, we need to align our careers with our contributions to Africa. So that's been a huge switch I made, where initially I wanted to become an accountant. And why? Because I would have made a lot of money from doing that. But as time went on, I had to reflect to say, but what contribution do I want to have in Africa? And therefore, how do I ensure that my career aligns with that? I now work as a project manager in a healthcare NGO, where I use a lot of my accounting background to make different decisions every day. And I find that I make more impact each day, so I'm a lot happier, and I'm contributing to Africa directly. So how does your career align with Africa's rise? Number 4, we need to consider health as a career option as well. There are so many different entry points into healthcare. It's not just about being a nurse or a doctor. A lot of clinics across the continent are not adolescent and youth friendly. What can you do to change that? You could become a trainer. You could work in logistics to get medication to pharmacies. You could work in manufacturing to manufacture protective gear. There are so many entry points into healthcare. And for as long as we've got this ever increasing youth population, we're going to need even more people involved in healthcare to ensure that should another COVID-19 happen in 10 years' time, it is something that our healthcare system can absorb and not be shocked by. Number 5, for those who are entrepreneurial, how are you solving youth unemployment in your community? We know that after COVID-19, there'll be mass youth unemployment. What are you going to do about it, or what are you doing about it? And I want to encourage those of you who are currently entrepreneurs, become a social entrepreneur. Look at what societal impact you can have. Number 6, read, and then share that knowledge with your community. As young people these days, we've got so much access to information, but how much of that information is stored in our heads and how much of it is shared with our different communities? And number 7, play your part. Whatever you are doing as a young person, it is so critical that you play your part. What are you doing? What are you doing in society? When you wake up every day, if you're staying at home, you're playing your part and you're flattening the curve. But what more can you do? So I want to thank Search Africa for having me here. I really hope that the contributions I've shared have been valuable and insightful. And if anyone would like to engage with me further, you're welcome to contact me on Twitter or Instagram or via email. I'm very much available. Thank you so much to Nazreen for hosting this platform.
Thank you so much, Farai, for joining us. What a pleasure to hear about the nexus between youth and activism, health and youth. I would also add that I think when you say we're not the futures of leaders of tomorrow we are the leaders of today. That really resonates with me, because I think we have this kind of a subconsciousness that keep telling us that we need to wait until we reach some certain age before we can be able to take legitimate responsibility of what's happening in our countries or our continent. So we have older people trying to put us down, telling us that, oh, you're too young to make a change. But we see from other continents and other countries that young people are bringing that change. So I think in this case, I would say that we need to step up and do more. And in looking at it from another perspective, I think young people most of the times do want to make change, but they aren't really given the platform and support to be able to evoke that change that we keep talking about we need. So I think there is need to come together and address it, and we are already doing that in so many ways, including through this platform. Just now listening to you say what you did. So yeah, that's what I want to say. So we have a few minutes for Q&A. So we're going to answer some questions. Most of them are directed to you, and it's one says, projecting on the long-term impact on Africa, the long-term impact Africa faces if the pandemic continues. What measures do you think governments can take to promote youth participation and inclusion if the pandemic continues? So Farai, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. Yes, all right. Thanks so much for that question. I mean, I think the first thing that our African governments need to do is to understand what is youth participation. And that means youth being involved in the different processes and decisions that are made. But there's a difference between meaningful youth participation and just, and what's the word to use? The tokenistic sort of youth participation. Very often you've got tokenistic youth participation, whereby youth are just considered an afterthought. But if we are to create the Africa we want, we need youth participation that is collaborative. So the moment a decision needs to be made, there are youth representatives who sit on the same table with our decision makers to make those decisions. In fact, youth then become decision makers as well. So I'd say that, I mean, especially with the pandemic, and you're right, with the lasting effects of it, and youth unemployment being one of them, I would task a lot of our governments with creating task teams about youth unemployment that include majority young people, whereby we are able to then explore ways and create different ideas to solve youth unemployment in our communities. And I think in having young people in these different task teams, steering the conversation, not just being a part of it, but steering it, we can definitely solve out a lot of the challenges that we will face in the future. But it's all about meaningful youth participation. And I'd encourage you to check out HEART's ladder. HEART spelled H-A-R-T, his ladder on meaningful youth participation. It's really good and shows where a lot of governments need to be and where they really are at the moment. I hope that's answered the question.
It does. It answered it pretty well. So on the website that you just gave, so what we're going to do is after this session, we're going to share it along with the recording with the participants so everyone can have access to it. So we're going to have our next speaker. Her name is Valine Diane. I don't really know how to pronounce her last name, so I'm not going to pronounce it wrong. I'll just not pronounce it at all. So she's going to be speaking about women's rights in crisis. I mean, throughout the past few weeks, we've heard about how the domestic violence have rise, and we really want to know what's causing it, what's the measures taken to protect women, and we want to know how the crisis is affecting women's rights and their access to basic healthcare. We would also explore responding to increased domestic violence and ways women can be protected. So Valine is going to come in right now and discuss about women's rights in crisis. Thank you.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly we can hear you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, my sister, and to Surge Africa for inviting me to join this webinar today. And I wanted to thank also our sister Farai's presentation and also our brother Abdullahi for the insights that they shared previously. COVID-19, we unfortunately all know what COVID and coronavirus means, and the impact not only at international level. We see the devastating consequences that we're seeing related to COVID-19, but I would like to give a bit of the perspective on the impact of COVID on women and on young women. We've seen a lot happening around violence, gender-based violence in this crisis. But before going into that, I would like for us to look also at the data. I think it's very important to look at data and governance, and how for us recording data is key, not only as young people, but as women, also young women, to make sure that the voices and perspectives are represented. So I think it's very urgent that all actors participating in COVID-19 response plan and activities embark on data collection on the impact of COVID-19 pertaining to violence against women, young women and girls. The reality is, as you know, is that what cannot be measured cannot be counted. So if we don't have the information on how many women have been victims of gender-based violence, sexual violence in terms of being at home on lockdown, for instance, in some countries, we need to make sure that we have the appropriate numbers, and not only the numbers, but also the faces and the names and information about these women, so we can create policies and mechanisms to answer to their needs. And I think it comes back to what our sister Farah mentioned about having the adequate infrastructures and services in Africa. So data, of course, is crucial also for policymakers, so we can also best answer and provide the responses platforms to make sure that we can answer to the consequences of COVID-19. When it comes to COVID-19 impact on violence against women, what we have noticed is that violence against women occurs throughout Africa in this difficult time and remains mainly underreported. We have seen that emerging data indicates that unfortunately the underreporting is not because we have less violence against women, it's access. How do we have access to digital platforms, for instance? So this brings us also to the digital divide. You know, coronavirus is putting us in front of several devastating challenges and shortcomings that we may have had. So how do we make sure that when people are observing social distancing, staying at home, how do we make sure that they have the adequate platforms to reach out and share some of the challenges and violences that they may be experiencing at home? You know, physical distancing affect women and particularly young people. We know that women and our brothers and sisters are working mostly in informal sectors, working on day-to-day jobs, or in sectors that do not provide the necessary safety net. So examples, of course, of these impacts includes health and financial stress on women, on young women particularly, but also on young men and boys, looking at how do we make sure that women have access to finances, that young people, and I stress the interrelationship between women, young people, and particularly young women in this context. The restrictions that are around COVID-19, as we can start to see now, increases, you know, power and control over who has access to resources. So this is an element that we need to consider as we move forward in terms of response planning around COVID-19. Unfortunately, COVID-19 is also exacerbating violence against children. This is another additional point that we need to look at. And workers, migrant, domestic workers, not only in Africa, we have seen reports of African migrant workers globally who've been assaulted, who were subjugated to violence, racial due to the crisis. So it's very important for us to look at how can we mitigate not only sexual and gender-based violence against women, against young women and young people in time of COVID-19, but also racial discrimination, xenophobia, and violence against migrants of African origins wherever they are in the world. I think in terms of response, looking at how could we address this challenge is, of course, bringing front and center women and young women's and youth voices at the center of COVID-19 response planning, making sure that we have a strong coordination. The coordination at continental level, our sister, the AU Youth Envoy, has been leading incredible online consultations with young women, young people in the 5 regions of the continent, making sure that their voices are heard and that policymakers, may they be at the UN, the World Health Organizations, the AU, and member states can integrate their perspectives. It's key, again, to have women's perspective, young people perspective into the response planning, because without that, we're missing a key important element which would have devastating consequences when we look at implementation. Because in the end, when we look at Africa, our continent is a young continent. It's a young and female continent. Women are the forefront of the markets. Women are leading households, caring for communities. So any plans, response plans to COVID-19 without centering women and young people will be short of what the main engagement should look like, and implementation as well. So in terms of looking at how do we move forward into responding to COVID-19, making sure that we have a young women and young people perspective, we need to make sure that women and young people's voices are taken into account, making sure that we look at the data regarding increased gender-based violence, regarding racial and xenophobia violence also, which is perhaps a bit taboo to discuss, but it's very important to include it in response planning, both at national and international levels. We need to make sure that we support families, communities, as you know, and we all know how, as women and as young people in age of working, we can carry families, our communities. So making sure that we release the burden that we put on women and young people in this time of coronavirus. Another element that I would like for us to reflect on is the challenge of accessing sexual and reproductive health services. And again, it comes back to the need for strong health infrastructures and services, looking at how do we strengthen the governance system at national level in partnership with regional and international organizations, looking at how can we make sure that we provide financial support for women and young people who have lost revenues. Now we have not seen much when it comes to, for instance, our women working in markets, but the strain of coronavirus in the upcoming weeks and months is going to show. So how do we make sure that we have financial relief packages that really target women and young people in informal sectors? And we need to make sure that women and young people are also part of the representation, in the leadership of the response planning, may it be at the national or regional and international level. And why is it so important? It comes back to the point that our sister Farah has mentioned, that leadership is not a given of tomorrow. We're not thinking we're the leaders of tomorrow, so today we're going to put our lives on hold and just wait and pray that things go well. The reality today is that young women and young people are already at the forefront, designing response plans, leading communities, bringing awareness, bringing information, also bridging the digital divide that we may have, So looking at how we make sure that representation of young people and women's voices are fully integrated at policy-making level. So making sure that we have youth outreach and women outreach through the relevant ministries, health ministries, gender ministries, through the United Nations, maybe through the World Health Organizations, the Africa CDC, the Center for Disease Control, the African Union, and all relevant private sector actors also when we're looking at the relief packages that are being distributed. We know very well that in times of peace, if we may call it peace, that aid packages are usually young women and young people are the last to receive help and aid packages. So making sure that those relief packages are specifically targeting women and young people. And I think a last point that I would like to raise, which is as important, is psychological safety, psychological assistance. This is a very uncertain time. This is a difficult time. We don't often talk about the pains that we may have inside, the worries, the uncertainties about keeping or finding a job to make sure that we're eating, that our families are safe. This causes psychological draining, making sure that if inside we're fine and we're good, then the rest will be good and fine as well. So making sure that if as young people and as women, if we're not feeling at peace or at ease in this very difficult time, the context makes it extremely worrisome that we reach out. So this is another important element, looking at psychological hotlines, for instance, or WhatsApp groups. We talk a lot about outreach and making sure that people around us are safe, perhaps having an online public platform on which young people and women can come together and discuss some of the challenges they're facing is also as critical. I think we're each other's brothers and sisters keepers. So as we come together to answer to COVID-19 and its challenges, looking at how we're keeping each other safe as well. So all in all, really, I think that the response to the pandemic should include and target gender and youth perspective, making sure that we address sexual, gender-based violence, that we include also stimulus financial packages. This is, again, related to governance, making sure that people have access to financial support in this difficult time. But people must also be informed, by concrete information. And our brother Abdullahi at the beginning mentioned it, making sure that people have access to truthful and right information regarding COVID-19, concrete data, making sure that we know what's happening and how can we be safely of support and remain safe ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darlene. That was very, very impactful. I would really like to apologize to you and everyone else because I think I didn't really presented you properly. So Darlene Diane is the policy advisor, women, peace and security coordinator of the African Women Leadership Network, which even before I say that, from her speech, you can tell that she has vast knowledge and experience in mainstreaming women's development into governance. I really like all the points that you have raised, and I also want to say a couple of things, but we're going to itch into Hamza's time, so I'm just gonna wait until during the Q&A session, and then I'll address a couple of things. So presenting our next speaker, Hamzat Lawal. Hamzat Lawal is the founder of Connected Development, one of the leading NGOs in Nigeria and Africa. He runs the biggest social accountability organization in Africa, and he's going to be talking about open data and governance. How are we tracking the data that is coming in? How are people able to access good and quality information? And in terms of the aid that is coming in, how do we access it? How do we hold leaders accountable, and how is the money being disbursed? So I think right now it is very important to how we rise out from the pandemic, and while people are still being impacted. So we would like to hear the processes, what's involved, and how we can be able to address that. So Hamza, please, if you can hear me, you can come in now. Thank you. So I think the network is acting up a bit. I can see that Hamzat is talking, but we can't hear you. Hamzat, please, if you can hear me, can you adjust maybe your microphone? Because I had a problem with that earlier as well. So maybe it's your microphone. If you can please adjust it. Thank you.
No. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly we can
you
hear
guys
you.
hear me?
Thank you. Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Yes, so I would just start again. My name is Hamza Lahab, please call me Hamza. I'm excited to be here. When we talk about open data, we're talking about information that are easily accessible, mission readable, where citizens, government, civil society, private sector can use to inform policy and decision making around governance. Africa and Nigeria was not ready for COVID-19, same as the world, but we are the continent that would be hit the most with this pandemic. When we had the index case in Nigeria, I'll use Nigeria as a case study, and I'll also share some information on what we're doing in 7 other African countries. When we had the index case, and when government started releasing resources, financial resources around tackling COVID-19, what we did was to start aggregating, mapping information and aggregating this information into a spreadsheet. And for us, what we were doing was to put, which government agencies this money committed to, where the money was coming from, and what the money was meant to do. And then, of course, individuals and private individuals and institutions started committing these resources. Mind you, this time is different from every other time because right now we're all at home. We cannot socialize. So what this means is, Follow the Money cannot deploy, had over 6,000 volunteers on our I Follow the Money platform. And, we can't, do ground truthing and even send freedom of information letter to government MDAs because we're all at home. So what we did was to deploy digital. So we deployed a digital campaign platform where we're now leveraging on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and other digital means to engage, to hold government to account, and to get feedback. I will just share a few examples. So, for instance, when NNPC came out and say they were committing $1 million for COVID-19 intervention, we engage NNPC Twitter handle and say, can you give us specific and breakdown of how you intend to utilize these resources? And the GMD of NNPC responded with his verified handle saying they were going to use all the companies who committed were going to use their procurement policy and internal policy to do this in-kind distribution. We now ask, if it's in-kind, how did you come up with this amount? Because for us, we want to be able to tie this amount to specifics and how you are going to donate this in-kind contribution. So for instance, the FCT administration in Abuja got 500 million naira check from a private bank, and we engaged them and say, what would you do with this money? And they said they were going to give 200 million to NCDC, and they were mute on the 300 million. So this also inform how we're engaging them, but we're also using digital platforms to mobilize young people. We're beyond mobilizing them, we're also educating them, because at first a lot of people didn't believe COVID-19 was real. And of course, fake news played a predominant role on this. And how are we countering fake news and misinformation? So right now, Follow the Money is in partnership with the Premium Times Center for Investigative Reporting. We're also partnering with Cables News Foundation, just to be sure that as much as we're countering misinformation, we are also ensuring that our own data that we publicly gathered, have been verified, have passed through a series of verification process before it goes public. At first, NCDP, when they give incident reports, they only look at numbers of cases, that's numbers of people that have tested positive, numbers of people that are being quarantined, and numbers of deaths. And we started a campaign and said, can you give us the numbers, the data of the tests that have been carried out so far? because you can't just give us this data and you're not giving us the numbers of tests that have been carried out in Nigeria. And we got a lesson from Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe, our colleagues in Zimbabwe, the Mukamba network, deployed a platform where they were helping government amplify all this information. But Zimbabwe Ministry of Health were giving Mukamba network data of the numbers of people that have been tested. Our colleagues also were helping government track, people that have been exposed to this virus using Google Map. So we used that lessons learned and we showed the Ministry of Health and NCDs in Nigeria and say, if Zimbabwe is doing it, why can't you provide us with this data? And before they now came public, and at first they said they've tested over 4,000 people in Nigeria. And we now said, okay, can you give us more geolocated data? How many people have you tested in the 36 states and the FCT? Because this is a holistic figure, because then we can put this side by side with people that have tested negative or positive, people in isolation, and then people who have died. Because Nigeria has a population of 200 million. As of now, we've tested less than 10,000. The last count was about 7,000 plus. And if you look at our population and numbers that we've tested, we've not really done well in that regard. So what we also did, the Ministry of Finance, the president set up the Presidential Task Force against COVID-19 chaired by the Secretary of the Government. And we said, the Ministry of Finance, rather, can you give us aggregated information on all the income and expenditure? And for the income, tell us who have donated, if it's government or private, and tell us how much money have been disbursed and to whom. And we're also saying that as much as this is a crisis, and I might mention that this is a humanitarian crisis, a health crisis, it's an economic crisis, it's a security crisis, it's a social crisis, and a political crisis. As much as we're in a crisis, we must always adhere to the laws of the land, because Nigeria is a signatory to the Open Government Partnership, and we have a law on open contracting. We are also saying that, are you adhering to open contracting standard when you procure? Because right now a lot of procurement is going on. They're procuring, masks, gears for health workers, and ventilators. So are you also adhering to open contracting standard and ensure that these resources were getting value for money? And now the Ministry of Health is working on an accountability framework, which we're informing. In Kenya, what we're doing in Kenya is to sensitize citizens using Twitter. So we've held a series of Twitter chats. This has been led by Eve Matthias, who works in the slum, and she's a budget expert, and also translating English information into Kiswahili. For Cameroon, when they had their index case, the president was nowhere to be found. It became, so for the first 20 days, the Minister of Health was giving updates, and after 20 days after the index case, they stopped giving updates. Right now, there's been a surge in fake news in Cameroon because no one is giving updates on numbers of cases, numbers of tests, quarantine centers, numbers of deaths. It's just crazy in Cameroon. There have been a series of money, international aid money from the US government, UK government going to Cameroon, but they've not been how this money has been spent, and also how palliative have been provided to citizens in Cameroon. Our colleague in Cameroon who is leading this campaign have even got a series of threats from users on Facebook particularly, because she's the one leading the campaign to enhance have mobilizing citizens to ask for accountability using these various platforms. So she's received a series of threats, from Boots accounts. So in the Gambia, there've been information that the quarantine center is not fully equipped, and people who are under quarantine are not being served health-wise properly. So our colleagues are doing an underground investigation again, where as much as they're doing ground truthing, they're also ensuring they adhere to World Health Organization and CDC's or their own government health standard around COVID-19. So they're using their cameras to take on interview and also do some underground work, which will be published. in Liberia, our colleague in Liberia who is leading the campaign is part of the government set up WASH working group, where they're also providing water facilities so that and detergent so people can wash their hands. But the biggest challenge is the lockdown is not being taken seriously because a lot of people still socialize and they still keep their market open. So when they go to markets, they see people not enforcing social distance. We've also observed that there have been series of human rights abuse in Nigeria and other African countries where security agencies are now extorting young people, particularly the targets are on young people, extorting young people, brutalizing people. And in Nigeria, we've lost over 20 lives already from police brutality and military brutality in the country. But by and large, at this point in time, the biggest means for accountability is using digital platform. And we've seen that even government is now engaging on Twitter. Now we're having a lot of Instagram Live with government people sharing updates. So, and I don't think this conversation on the role of, post-COVID-19, how can government be more accessible and be more responsive? Because we've also seen COVID-19 as much as it's a crisis, also an opportunity to engage more and how government can reach mass audience. We're also leveraging on radio, using radio to reach millions of people, Hausa radio, Kano radio, Kiswahili radio, and even Radio France International, just to reach both Anglophone and Francophone speaking countries to provide information and also compare notes of what's happening in various African countries that we currently work in. I want to also tie my conversation on my input around job creation, because right now the only way young people can be meaningfully employed is using digital skills. So we're going to be running series of capacity building and enhancement for young people on how to use tools, how to get certified digitally, and so that they can remain relevant, because after COVID-19, Africa might lose over 50% of jobs in the continent. And post-COVID-19, how can we also stay afloat? Because right now, Nigeria, for instance, income is and our budget is based on oil benchmark, and right now, the oil price has crashed. So, we're also doing analysis of the economic impact and how the government needs to put in place some shockers beyond providing palliative that is not transparent, but how can they provide shockers and keep SMEs and also provide jobs, for teaming young people. And of course, we've seen the rise of crime in all of these countries, including Nigeria. Thank you.
Hello, Hamzat. Thank you very much for coming in. What's a great speech you have there. So you are right on time, and we have a couple of questions waiting for us. So I'm just gonna get right to it. So we have a few questions for Berlin. I hope Berlin is still online. Ayo, if you can please unmute her so that she would be able to answer the question. So the first question we have is there any provision for women to be protected from domestic violence that you are aware of for African countries?
Is that for me?
No, it's for Berlin. So we have two questions for you and two
Okay.
questions for Berlin, but considering, okay, I think let's just wait until Ayo unmutes her or get a hold of her. So let's just start with you while you're here. Sorry, Hamzat. And so this person said that, do you think that even in this time, we can count on our African governments to take the right approach to leadership in protecting poor people and using aid where it's needed? Hamzat, this is for you.
I think the thing about accountability is the more you demand, the more you supply. It's just an economic equilibrium. African governments were, if you look at the trend, COVID-19 outbreak happened sometime around December, but an African government did not prepare beforehand. And even when it came to Africa, when we started having index cases, they did not take proactive measure to curtail the spread of COVID-19. Now we're even dealing with community infection, because COVID-19 has now gotten to the grassroots. So again, I think it's also a time for sober reflection among citizens, because we believe that COVID-19 intervention and how government responded should definitely inform debate before elections in another 2 to 4 years around African countries, because again, it shows that governance itself is around, having governments who would rise to occasion like this, and governance should be around crisis and ensuring that citizens are protected, particularly providing them with social amenities during crisis and be responsive. So, and if you look at, government right now, they're not open, they're not transparent, they don't want to be accountable. And we've seen cases of corruption, we've seen cases of malpractices, we've seen cases of embezzlement during COVID-19 where they don't even adhere to procurement practice or standard. So it's still same old, even in the era of COVID-19.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I will just add to what you said and say that why we want our governments to have that leadership role, to do what they're expected to do. I think it's also equally important for us to know that they would only be able to do that if we demand it from them. And I think the fear far outweighs the demand of good governance, and we're also uninformed. Many people are not informed on how governments work, which is why most of the time we think they're doing us a favor in, allocated projects or even in government projects in general. So I think if people know that they have the right to demand, they have the right to ask their governments of so many things, of in fact everything, I think it would reduce the poor governance, and it would give people more confidence to demand accountability, to demand good governance.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why data plays a key role, because again, without access to information or data, you don't even know how to engage or how to follow the money, or even know what government is doing in itself. And the fact that government would hold data at this point, they're also helping to propagate fake news, because if you don't provide information, that's when mischief makers would run with fake news.
That's correct. So I think you've almost answered the next question, because the other question says, how can youths and people in general support the accessibility of open data? So how can we support the accessibility of open data?
I think we have a role to play, not just to support accessibility of open data, but also countering fake news or misinformation. Because right now, with the era of open data, don't consume all the information you see on social media. Just look at government verified handle and government channel for information. But how can we support access to information? Is engaging government institution or individual using digital platform. Because again, it's about sustaining your approach. So it's not a one-off thing, because government will not respond to you if you just come one-off and ask and then you don't act. You have to be consistent. You have to be able to also mobilize other voices and speak in one voice, have the numbers, and then government will respond to you.
I believe so. So thank you so much, Hamzi, for answering the question. So we have just 2 questions for Berlin, but she's not responding. I think she left the program. So, but the first one said, okay, you're here. Thank God. I almost answered it for you, because I remember in your speech you said that Africa is a continent of women. So I wanted to show my feminism by just jumping in the gun for you and answering your question. Thank you so much, Verlene. I'll read out the question right now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Okay, good. So is there any provision for women to be protected from domestic violence that you are aware of in African countries? So this is specific to African countries.
Yeah, thank you, my sister. I think it comes back to what we discussed before, and even our brother Hamzat has mentioned it. Access to information and data. At the level of Africa, we have several instruments, including the Maputo Protocol, which really stresses women's rights and protection against violence, may they be gender-based violence, exclusion, or even sexual violence. So we have continental frameworks at the level of Africa, but we also have, and here again, I think this is an important point, and I want to build on what was just said. Several national governments, several countries do have provisions to protect women at national level against gender and sexual violence. However, one of the most important gaps is implementation. We need to make sure that those provisions of protection and advancement of women's rights and young women and young people in Africa that are inscribed in instruments are not just words on paper, but are implemented. And I think here I would like to really tap, I hope that we have young people and young women part of women's rights organizations online. I think we need to really tap into women's rights organizations, women's rights and services, which unfortunately, as we know, very often lack funding and are leading incredible work in stressful environments with overwhelming requests. So with the rise of gender-based violence that we're seeing now with COVID-19, most of the women's rights organizations I engage with and I discuss with, and even women at individual level who are on the front line, offering psychological support, financial support also. We help each other as women in this very difficult time, but also social assistance are overwhelmed, and indeed we need to step up when it comes to making sure that the governments in plural are involved and supporting national women's-led organizations, because the reality is that COVID-19 is really bringing at the forefront of what we're doing the need for preparedness, making sure that we're prepared to answer to the consequences, including sexual and gender-based violence. I mentioned before, making sure that we have hotlines where women and even young people can engage and seek support and psychological, financial, or social services that are necessary in this time. But we need also to look at how do we best support shelters, in response to gender-based violence that might be happening during the time of coronavirus. So perhaps also us as young people, as young men and women who are leading, how do we make sure that we hold all the various institutions accountable to provide social support? For instance, the shelters, we could look at having shelters that would welcome a minimum of women. We know that with coronavirus, it is important to keep social distancing, but at least having a place where women and young people can go in case of being victims and survivors of gender and sexual-based violence during this time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pauline. I think that really sums it up. I think people do need protection, and some of the implications I see from this angle is that we really have this sort of cultural implication in Africa where women are not really well protected and they're not really well supported. So I think if we can, add that into whatever framework governments have prepared for people, in order for us to support more and protect more. And for the perpetrators, I think there should be a very strong law, to hold people accountable for what they do to these women, because for so long in Africa and in so many other continents, the other gender or any gender-based violence, we know that the other gender, is known to just get away with it, as opposed to if it's a woman that commits that crime. So I think now more than ever, we need to protect women and support them, especially since we are confined in a very small space now, and getting help might not be as easy as how it used to be.
Yeah.
So the other question.
Before
I'm listening.
I'll go very quickly. I like the point you mentioned because I don't want the brothers to feel excluded from the conversation. I think it's very important for us, of course, there are the traditional, gender roles and gender violence, based violence that as women, we are victims and survivor of, looking at how do we make sure that we change the way that things are going. But it's also very important to look at how do we make sure that we recognize also men who are standing up, in the face of gender-based violence, and also reminding ourselves that gender-based violence, patriarchy has no gender. You unfortunately can be a woman and inflict violence on other women. We've seen that. We've been also victims of that. Every woman, I'm sure every woman can have a reference of being violated by another woman. So I think those are elements to keep in mind, but also looking at how can we have a strong and robust engagement together and speaking frankly and making sure that women's rights are at the front and the center of the responses. And I think I like the point you mentioned on accountability, keeping people accountable for the mistreatment and terrible behaviors that they may be undertaking. Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you very much for bringing your last point about violence have no gender. I think it's very important for people to speak on that and recognize that, even though honestly we don't really talk about that because we just want to say that it's often on women, and it is, but I think it's also important to bring up a few men, the few men that have stood up for us. So thank you so much for making that point. And so the next question is, do you think young people can contribute to safety for women, even if they don't hold a leadership role?
This is for me?
Yes, it is for you.
Thank you.
Let me read it again. Do you think young people can contribute to safety for women, even if they don't hold a leadership role? I think this question is addressing if people can contribute to protecting women even if they don't have a position, because often we feel you can only make change if you have a position or a leadership role. So how do you think people can contribute to protecting women even if they don't have a role?
Thank you, my sister. I think one important element I want to share with our brothers and sisters online is that leadership is never personal. We really need to remind and always keep this at the heart of our minds, at the center of what we do, that leadership is never positional. Leadership is not about where I sit. It's not about my title. It's about what I do and how do I respond to the environment that is around me. For instance, I've had the opportunity to go throughout our continent and meet some of our mothers who are in the Lake Chad, some of our mothers in South Sudan. And when you would look at them, the first assumption would be that, they're not leaders, because the image of a leader that we have is someone who has a big office, a big title, and a lot of people working for them. And I really want to break that myth that leadership is positional, because leadership can come from anywhere. It can come from a 13-year-old advocating for climate change, as it can come from a 25 or a 45 or a 60-year-old working in the field, in agriculture, or wherever. So I think once we know that, once we're convinced and encouraged by the fact that we are the change that we want to see, that we can build protection, that we can be part of the solution, then of course we can create, protection systems. For instance, I have in mind sisters who are now in Niger. When they're working as civil society organizations, they would not have what we would consider, big leadership positions, but they are leaders in terms of implementing and making sure that they're providing the tools, information. We discuss information. Not everyone has access to information. How do we make sure that you provide the necessary, for instance, instruments, maybe legal instruments that protect women, or social, economic tools to help women or young people thrive? Because in the end, I think one important element for all of us is not only to survive. We don't want to survive. We're tired of surviving. Nobody wants to survive anymore. I think we need to move from the perspective of being bystander actor surviving to proactive actor thriving and really changing communities. So I really encourage everyone, whoever you are, wherever you are, to be a leader. And it can start in your family, for your mother, your brothers, your sisters, your father, and your community, in your street, your country, your region. So it really is all within. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pauline. I think that was very deep, and that speaks to all of us, whether we're here during this webinar or not. So we have one last question, and then we would round up. And the question is for Abdullahi, and it said, how can we maximize media participation to cover more local news? So Abdullahi, if you can hear me, please come on.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Great, yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, I really, in fact, I've benefited a lot from the conversation from Belen and Farah, because they actually reflect on a project I am working on currently on the issue of violence against women, because we have a lot of unreported cases, and I felt like I've gotten a lot of information from personal friends that I am working on packaging it and presenting in a form of exhibition to just share on the line and then address some of this issue. So I think one of the most important thing now is that the various stakeholder, like Farai has mentioned earlier on, we all have a lot of roles to play in terms of either contributing positively or helping other people, empower them in what they do. But I think in this area of maximizing the media, I think it's important that uh, the relevant stakeholders, like platforms such as the Surge Media, can actually come up with a strategy in such a way that they can use the important, like maybe the way we have some of these celebrity engaging in live chats, discussing topics that are not really of productive value to us in this situation, because they're just trying to just while away time. We could channel this kind of energy and address certain important issues, especially for instance, the issue of violence against women. It's really a big problem right now, because I have direct information from people that I know, and now I can imagine a lot of people that I don't have access to them. So we can create a system where we can actually bring the relevant authorities, people who could advise, give advice, people who could bring and share their problem, and find a way of engaging them so that we can educate even others that we do not have access to them, but they have access to the various platforms that we have. I think it will go a long way. We can't just sit down and wait for government to do everything. But the relevant stakeholder can also use their social media platform to address some of these issues.
I totally agree with you. I do. And thank you so much for that input. So we have come to the end of our webinar, and I want to thank everyone for engaging and inspiring the conversation. We've got Hamzat Lawal, founder of Connected Development. He talks about open data and governance. Then there is Miss Valene Subroidu. I hope I pronounce it right. She is the policy advisor, women, peace and security coordinator of the African Women Leadership Network. She spoke about women rights in crisis. And then Farai Mubaiwa, she's the co-founder of Africa Matters, and she talked about the nexus between youth and health. And then there is Abdullahi Megaskia. He is a filmmaker and a social activist, and he talks about maximizing media, in a time of crisis. So again, I would like to just cap and say that the Business Unusual webinars are aimed at addressing critical issues in Africa that the COVID-19 pandemic could possibly aggravate, which may lead to civil unrest or humanitarian crisis. What we do with our discussion is lay ground for interactive discourse with experts on how to respond or tackle these challenges. Thank you so much to everybody that have joined in and engaged with us. Thank you for the questions, and to the speakers, thank you so much for such an impactful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
That we should start. I was starting on the 1st of May, but